Today, private schools, Princetonian plutocrats, and how inequality has broken the American brain. I'm Cliff Mark, and this is Good in Theory. Today on Good in Theory, we have Matthew Stewart. He's the author of 6 books, including his most recent called The 9.9%, The New Aristocracy, that's entrenching inequality and warping our culture. This is a book about class and inequality in America. And Matthew, I want to thank you for coming on, and thank you for writing this book, because not only is it full of insight and great arguments and analysis, but unlike a lot of books about inequality, it's actually a lot of fun to read. It's got all this rich anthropological detail about the upper middle class in America. You're having a lot of fun. It reads almost like satire. So I would recommend this book to anyone interested in the topic of inequality. And I've already recommended it to other people. Thanks for writing it. To begin our discussion, I'd like you to explain why it is your book is about the 9.9%. Why are we talking about them and not the 10% or the 1% or any other group?
Right. So, and thanks for the comments about the writing. So the 9.9% is just a kind of mathematical heuristic, but let me lay it out so that it doesn't sound mysterious. The story about rising inequality is pretty well known now. For the last half century, it's been increasing dramatically, especially in the United States. And I apologize, the book is focused mainly on the United States, but some of it does have global implications. And it's usually told as a story of us versus them, with us being the 99% and them being the 1%. But when you look at the numbers, that's not actually what they tell us. So the wealth distribution numbers show that all of the relative increase in wealth concentration has gone to the top 0.1%. So it's really just that sliver at the top. And even within that, it's the top 0.01% that have gotten the lion's share. And then conversely, all of the relative decline has gone to the bottom 90%. So everybody every decile or centile below the 90th percentile has lost relative wealth share, which is always quite an astonishing fact. But then, of course, that leaves this group in between, the 9.9%. And that's the focus of the book.
Actually, just let me interrupt you for a second there and summarize the class structure that you've just laid out. So you're dividing up America into 3 groups, right? At the bottom, 90% of people, they're pretty much stagnant. They haven't enjoyed any of the growth in the economy over the past 40 years. They're stuck. And at the tippy top, there's the 0.1%. Billionaires are in here, people just getting fabulously rich, all the, people just killing it over the same time period. And between the super rich and the vast majority, there's still the 9.9%. They're not nearly as rich as the billionaires, but they're still doing a lot better than 90% of people. These are your upper middle class people, your doctors, your lawyers, management consultants, people like that, right? So you took this group of people as the subject of your book. Why are they so important? Why are they more important to the story than, say, the 0.1% super rich?
Yeah, so the 9.9%, first of all, is actually in wealth terms bigger than those other 2 groups. So they're important for that reason. But there's a general abstract point that I think is very important to get across, and that's that inequality is about a lot more than dollars and cents. So we tend to think of it just as the fact that there are a few billionaires running around and lots of people with not enough money. But in fact, it gets into us in a significant way. So by framing the issue this way, in a complicated 3-part scheme where some of us may be members or aspiring to be members, I want to reframe inequality as not an us versus them issue, but as we're all implicated to some degree. And I suppose the second, more concrete reason is that this 9.9% is what really drives our culture. I mean, the 0.1%, they do drive the culture, but they're kind of idiosyncratic, they're bizarre, they're alien creatures. For day-to-day, what people aspire to in the United States is to become a member of the 9.9%. That's what defines our life goals. It seeps into our culture. It sets our values. It tells us what's good, what's bad, and who's doing well and who's not. And it's not directly tied to the money in absolute quantity terms. It's just that's what constitutes success. And the broader point in the historical analysis is that as that 9.9% has gotten significantly wealthier with respect to the 90%, because that's what's happened. So the ratio of the wealth of the 9.9% to the 90% has grown dramatically. The hill is a lot harder to climb. As that has happened, the value systems that dominate all of society, not just the 9.9%, but everybody, have changed. They've changed dramatically.
Okay. Right. Great. I mean, one of the ways that you put it in the book that I found really nice was you say that the 9.9% being a member of this class or group, it's not so much about a bank balance, but it is a way of life. So maybe let's talk about the life of your archetypical 9.9%er. Where do they start? Where do they go to school? Who are their parents? And we can talk about how those values at each stage of life kind of infiltrate the whole of the culture.
So there are the people who are basically able to do it, who are, the paid up members of the 9.9%. And let's start with them, and then we'll see how the values filter down below. I open the book in a way with the easiest part of the social analysis, at least for anybody who's living in my neighborhood, for example, which is the kind of craziness about parenting, right?
All right.
And I had some fun with this, I admit it. The ads for the nannies. They are over the top.
So tell us a little bit about that.
But they're real.
That ad.
They're real. I mean, that's the thing. I didn't make this stuff up, and I have to say I put it in there because I've kind of seen that sort of behavior. And so just so that your listeners get what I'm talking about, these are ads where, you have hyper successful business people who are very, very busy, too busy to really raise their kids, and yet they are absolutely fanatically committed to raising the best possible child who is, from the beginning, they're aiming straight for the Ivy League. And they are going to invest everything to make sure that the little one is fully developed spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually, and ends up with a good resume. How do they do that? Well, they put out these ads for these nannies, and these ads are insane. They basically ask for a nanny who has university level education in child development, who is capable of running spreadsheets so she can do clear analyses of household budgeting and household expenses. One of them wanted the nanny also to be able to sort of essentially be a decathlete, because she wanted to have the kids go river swimming and engage in other kinds of exotic sports. And this is not just one kind of crazy parent. This is it's happening in all the major metropolitan centers. But look here, so all that's kind of fun and games with the foibles of the successful members of the 9.9%, and really arguably at the sort of top end of that spectrum. But a lot of the same ideas about parenting have filtered down. It's just they filtered down to people who can't afford it. So then and this is backed up with a fair amount of sociological evidence, surveys, and so on, that parents, even at lower levels of the wealth distribution, are still investing huge amounts of time, and they'd love to have a nanny, but they can't afford the nanny. But they essentially get stretched thin. And so that also shows up in incredible parental unhappiness. So it turns out that the United States has some of the unhappiest parents in the world, which is itself a paradox when you consider just how much happiness the whole parenting thing is supposed to ooze in our culture, right? I mean, with all the talk about the wonderful games and the thrilling adventures and the great development for your kid and all that, it turns out that parents...
When you got to do it 80 hours a week, it becomes miserable like anything else.
Yeah, unless you can afford the nanny, right? So, so that's, I think, an illustration of the way in which the values that are kind of conceived and set at the top end then filter down, but they filter down in a very problematic way. So, I take it as a sign of a system that's out of skew. And there's also good evidence comparing countries that backs up this kind of claim that economic inequality dramatically changes parenting styles across the culture, not just within specific classes, but across the culture.
That is interesting, though, that economic inequality just makes parenting more miserable for everyone.
Yeah, and arguably it's not so great for the kids, right? I mean, I don't think it's a terrible thing to have
let's get to that.
names.
So we know who the parents are. That's the model 9.9%er is born into this family where they're raised by a very well-educated but undocumented nanny, and then they're off to school. I guess private, competitive preschool, private schools, and so on. What is their path as they continue on?
So what's happened is that the private schools have increasingly become a vector for those who have wealth to pass it on to their kids in the form of cultural capital. It's not just private schools, of course, because the American system is amazing. We have a system that takes this public good of education and it funds it locally, and the local areas are increasingly segregated by wealth. So we have pseudo public schools. We have a kind of private school network masquerading as a public school network. You can go to these great public schools. You just have to buy the $2 million house in order to go there.
And all of this wealth segregated public schools, the private schools, the super intensive parenting with the expensive nannies, this is all with a view to getting these little 9.9%ers into a great college so they can remain in the elite class. Is that right?
Yeah. So, and this is also a good place to point out that some of the core values of the 9.9%, if you take them down to the root level, they're actually good, right? I mean, education is a good thing. And that's what...
In moderation, like anything else.
Well, it's in moderation, and it also has to make sense. So, I mean, if you educate too many people to do something, well, then education stops being a good thing. And what's happened with the American education system, and people don't appreciate how much it has changed in this respect. At first, there was no public university system. Then, starting in the late 19th century, we created a public university system. In the middle decades of the 20th century, up to the sort of final, the third quarter, I would say, that public system was remarkably effective in bringing education to a large number of people who could make use of it. But what's happened in starting the last quarter of the 20th century and up through now is that the education has become a great class sorting mechanism. So we have too many people going through an overly expensive higher education system after going through this very segregated and kind of unfair secondary system. And those who can get into that top sliver, they do very well. They get appointed to their positions, the 9.9%. And the other ones get this big load of debt that kind of sinks them like a rock down into the 90%. And it's not it really is not a good system. It's not a good system. And yet the way most Americans respond to it is, rather than think about changing the system, they focus on the kids, and they want to change their kids.
Personal responsibility.
Yeah, they want to change the kids so that they succeed within this slightly insane system. And so you were asking what happens then to the kids. Well, I mean, I'm not a professional psychologist, but I do read the studies, and I can see a bit of what's going on. I think there's some gray in there. I think it's great to push people and so on and throw them into competitions, but we've overdone it. I mean, it's just pretty obvious that we've overdone it. I mean, it's crazy. You have high degrees of mental illness among teenagers. And I know that it's not, the college game isn't the only thing driving it. People will blame social media and so on, but it's a factor, and it's not good. And then that then raises the question: well, if we love our kids so much, why is it that we're doing this to them? What's really driving a process that we kind of know isn't best for them? And that takes us back to the structural economic inequalities that I'd like people to pay attention to.
Right. So just to recap a little. About this transformation of the education system, you're telling us that the public university system, the public college system in the States really started getting built up mid-20th century, and it brought in a lot of new people. It became more egalitarian, more people were admitted, and that probably helped them join the middle class. But then it's changed since then. So can you tell us a little bit about how it got more expensive and more competitive, leading to this high-pressure race to get your kids in?
So there are many pieces to the story, but if there's a simple and straightforward one, it's that state governments decided that they simply wouldn't fund it. The federal government came in with a well-intentioned but ultimately hugely problematic program to create debt that would allow students to go, but then dump them with the debt. And so the burden for the public universities shifted from the public to individual students who then were in a position of having to place bets. And if you have a society where you know that if you go to college, you're going to have some chance of moving ahead and having an opportunity, and if you don't go, you're basically locked out, well, you'll take risks, you'll take gambles. And that's what many students have done. So that's I think the most important part of the story. The other part has been the creation of these boutiques, universities that have essentially hogged the prestige. And it's an obvious point, I hate to say, because I was a beneficiary of this system, having gone to these fancy universities myself. But we have a system that funnels public money to the richest universities. Right? They have these unbelievable endowments. Princeton has over $4 million per student in its endowment. Harvard has close to that. Yale has close to that. And that money is partly from you, well, maybe not you because I guess you're in Canada, but it's from taxpayers, because all of that is tax advantaged money. It's tax deductible and donated. The returns are generally tax free, and they're of course go to education. So that has created this strange system where we have the best universities in the world because they are also the richest, and they've cornered this prestige, and they're also happen to be the oldest American universities, but they also are small. They're tiny. They don't serve the public. They serve an increasingly narrow elite, and they end up being kind of trophies that guide the lives of 9.9%. As an individual playing within that game, of course, people make the obvious choice. Do I send my child off to the underfunded state college or university that's may not provide much of a leg up, or do I make the extra effort and push them ahead with this by sending them into one of the special places? And so that's people have by and large tried to do the second thing. It's increasingly difficult to do, and it obviously doesn't work.
Well, I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, but for the people who get in, they do.
I guess that's what
they do get appointed
right.
to.
No, it doesn't work for everyone. It's not a system that moves society forward. It definitely moves individual people forward.
Right. So our 9.9%er, competitive preschool, private school, Princeton, then they graduate. They're going to go out there and make it. What happens to them next?
Well, there's two other parts of the story we need to get out. There's that they get married and they get a house, right?
Right.
And there's a lot more to the story, by the way. I don't want people to think my book is just like domestic analysis, because I think there's a lot to be said about the economic structure and so on. But let's just focus on the lifestyles of these semi-rich and not famous. They get married, and there is evidence that we have assortative mating. That is, that they like tends to marry with like. And so the members of the elite tend to marry the members of the elite, and aristocracies have always done this, and that's what we're seeing now. There are two other aspects of it that are worth drawing attention to. It turns out there's even more sorting at the bottom end. So if you are someone without a high school degree, the odds that you'll marry somebody else without a high school degree have gone up dramatically, and they've gone up higher actually than at the other end, the people with advanced degrees. So that's kind of interesting. And the other much more important point is that it's not like city mouse marries city mouse and country mouse marries country mouse, because what happens is that the city mouse marries the city mouse and the country mouse just doesn't get married at all. That is to say, among the working classes, the bottom deciles of the wealth distribution, the marriage rates have plummeted. They've just gone down. And again, it's a complicated story. I don't want to get all monocausal about it, but on the other hand, let's talk about the big elephant cause in the room, which is people don't get married if they don't have the money to make for a viable marriage partner.
But you're saying that it's not the deplorable morals of the working class?
Yeah, exactly. But of course then that's part of the value system of the 9.9% is to say, oh yeah, it is their morals. They just have bad values, right? But these sociological trends, I think, are so pronounced that you can see them from afar, even with the haziest of statistics. Marriage has kind of collapsed among the working classes, but it's actually holding pretty strong and steady at the top end of the economic spectrum.
Good for them, I guess. But
yeah. And then there's the houses. So we should talk about the houses.
Yeah.
So they move into good neighborhoods because the American system now is your zip code is a big part of who you are, and part of that is that of course the zip code is what's redistributed a lot of the wealth in the country. I mean, there's some analyses that suggest that the reason why the 9.9% has held onto its wealth and the reason why the 90% has lost it is mainly that you've got homeowners in good zip codes in one group and you've got non-homeowners in bad zip codes in the other group. So that's a big part of the story. And here again, the kind of the cultural things start to play in when you look at, frankly, the NIMBYism, right? We all know about this, right? Nobody wants anything done in their backyard. So the 9.9%ers move into a good neighborhood, and the first thing they do is they throw cement over anybody else's plans of moving in, right? Make sure that the population density stays low.
Yeah, well, they didn't pay that money to be in a neighborhood with, I don't know, a tall apartment building or public housing or anything else.
It's true. Look, and if you're a homeowner and you pay a certain amount of money for a property, then of course you're going to be extremely angry and upset when someone does something to the neighborhood that you perceive as affecting the value of your property. And in fact, that's just the prime motivator of most people. And this is where our political culture of tracing everything back to individuals becomes so problematic, because if we just look at the individual behavior, then people in that category will say, yeah, what are you going to blame me for trying to protect my property value? And I have to say, well, it's not like you're the cause of the problem, but you're not solving the problem, and you're kind of contributing to perpetuating it, because the reality is that we do have a problem, and it is essentially a social problem, a public problem. And don't kid yourself that this is sort of the way nature works. Zoning laws are not created by nature. We have zoning laws; those are human creations. They're often horribly applied. They're often really appalling abuses of local power and so on. But we need to figure out how we can apply them in a way that's fair for everybody and not in a way that's kind of opaque and that ultimately works to entrench the advantages and privileges of a small group in society.
So maybe don't hate the player, hate the game, but also fuck the players too.
I
without
guess
them,
kind
there's
of
no
a slightly
game.
ambivalent thing there. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, don't hate the player, but the player's contributing to this thing, and maybe we all need to think about playing a different game. And by the way, they're playing different games in other countries. I'm not saying that any country has a complete solution to any of these problems, but it's not like most of the solutions are impossible. I think that's another kind of dead end that Americans tend to get into. They'll say, oh, it's just nature. It's just, people are different. Some people are smart, some people are dumb, some people, work hard, other people don't work hard. And so you get, and so consequently you get rich white neighborhoods in one place and poor neighborhoods of color in another place. It's just a fact of nature. And that's, that's sort of delusion and self-indulgence in my view.
I regret to tell you it's not only Americans.
Yeah, no, I totally accept that. And one of the interesting things is I've gotten feedback on this project from people in other countries, and by and large they describe very similar phenomena in their own countries. So no country is solved. But I do think that America is kind of on the cutting edge in not a great way on this, and the numbers, the wealth distribution numbers back that up. So it's much more skewed in the United States, and the other disparities too. The racial disparities and the geographic disparities within the United States are significantly more pronounced than in most of the I guess what we used to call the industrialized countries. So the United States looks a little more like places like Brazil and India than it does Germany or Japan.
Great. So that is a geographic perspective. The U.S. is more unequal than other countries. The disparities are getting bigger, and the upper class has more advantages. But what about a historical perspective? Has it always been the case that the 9.9% or the upper middle class, the elite, hasn't it always been the case that they're defending their own class position against those below them?
I think historically it's too simple to say that that's just like a nasty class that's out to exploit. I think that actually they played a key role in creating a vibrant economy. But with rising inequality, with the growth of oligopoly and cartelized markets and so on, they have become kind of twisted. And the 9.9%, by sort of manning that machinery, by running, the machine that keeps that system in place, are directly contributing to inequality. It's a more complicated argument, but
so once upon a time, managers and lawyers did contribute to society and help the economy, and now they're more the helpers of the oligarchs funneling wealth upwards.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, look, it's way too simplistic. There were absolutely rotten, racist lawyers in the past, and so on. But when you have a system that distributes wealth upwards to an oligarchy, those oligarchs will tend to hire a professional class and a managerial class whose main role is to protect their wealth, and that's what they do, and they do it very well. And it's very hard to disentangle that from a legitimate function, because professionalism does have a certain legitimate function, right? You want your doctor to be professional in the sense that the doctor will give you advice that's in your interest and not in his or her economic interest, right? And you want a manager to kind of, resolve the agency problem and be able to, work on behalf of all the stakeholders in a particular economic activity. So those are important roles in any functioning economy. But when you have massive inequality, they get twisted. Huge parts of the medical profession at this point, sadly, are organized around the project of maximizing profits for a few large corporations, and the managerial elite has become, heroically parasitic. And I mean, no, seriously, when you look at the executive compensation, I mean, it's just hilarious. And I know some of these guys because they went to school with at these fancy universities, and they're nice guys, but are they worth $20 million, $60 million a year? Of course not. It's preposterous. It's just daylight robbery. But and of course they're beyond the 9.9%, but it's that 9.9% culture that essentially elevates them, and
Right. Speaking of your rich friends from university, let me ask you how the economic aspect of your argument maps onto politics in America. Because on the one hand, the 9.9%, these are rich people. These are managers, professionals. They make a lot of money. And stereotypically, traditionally, the Republican Party is the party that wants to cut rich people's taxes. But in your book, when you talk about the 9.9%, they sound a lot like rich liberals specifically. So how does the economic story map onto the political story in the States?
The important empirical point I would make is that the 9.9% is not just white liberals. So if we think about it in purely economic terms, it does skew liberal, but only by, something like, I don't know, maybe 10 points, something like that. So it's pronounced. A huge structural issue in American politics right now is that, yes, that upper middle class has migrated in large numbers the Democratic Party. However, there's still a very large group that's in the Republican Party, and you can't say that that's not part of this whole thing. And I guess the final empirical point I'd make is that there isn't an obvious overlap between the economic interests of this group and their politics. In fact, there's often a kind of a disconnect, and it's really only in their kind of the unspoken part of the politics where you see them acting in a sort of class interest way. So the overt politics of a lot of the 9.9% is in fact about reform, and that can be sometimes right-wing reform, but usually it's left-wing. But then when you look at their behavior, like, what they do when it comes down to, what to do with their local school and their neighborhood and so on, that's when you can see that.
We would love the state to build a lot more public housing, but in no specific neighborhood.
Yes, exactly. In your neighborhood, not mine.
Exactly.
So, it's complicated. And again, I just want to say that class analysis is too simple. It's not. The important thing to understand is the way in which unequal systems that essentially generate, rents, to use the economic language, that those kinds of systems only create that the creation of economic class interest is only one small part of their action. Because another much bigger part is the sort of disruption of reasonable human relations and the creation of kind of disintegrated or fragmented societies.
Okay, let's just take a minute with that, because this is a really interesting and big argument in the book. And the idea is that unequal societies don't just create separate classes with interests that are objectively opposed to each other. It's that inequality actually harms human reason. It makes people less reasonable and therefore less able to get along properly. Is that right? Can you explain how that works?
I am a philosopher, so I'm committed to making these abstract statements. And my abstract statement is that inequality,
you're on the right podcast.
Inequality makes human beings unreasonable. And there are two senses in which it does that. One is that I think it's unreasonable to be unequal. That is to say, I think human beings are naturally equal in a certain sense. I don't mean that everyone's the same height or anything like that, but I mean that if you organize human society, it's pretty difficult to do that in a way that does not presume a high degree of natural equality. And that's generally because you're organizing society for multiple generations, not just for you and me or the three of us gathered in a room, but rather you're creating a system. And it's difficult to do that in a reasonable way without making the assumption about natural equality. But there's more to it than that. There's a kind of sort of more biological argument, which is that human beings have certain mental heuristics that they use in analyzing moral situations and analyzing just problems that they face in their life. And those heuristics do have a kind of arbitrary character. They didn't arise from pure reason. They arose from evolution, human experience, the general human condition. And the most important condition throughout the early and most extended period of human development was equality. So human beings essentially have a moral apparatus that starts with the presumption that humans are equal, and then works around that. And in early human societies, there was nothing like the degree of inequality that obtained after civilization, large-scale civilization, beginning with what we call somewhat problematically the agricultural revolution, arose. So I think that kind of unreasonability is, when you take a cognitive apparatus that's designed or that it works in certain kinds of conditions, and then you radically change those conditions, you get bad thinking. And that's
so it's the same
happened.
kind of argument, our taste buds go for sweet and fatty and salty things. And that's because in a certain natural environment that was nutritionally sound, whereas in an environment created by PepsiCo, it'll kill you.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just taking that basic argument, or it's like the thinking fast, thinking slow argument that we have these heuristics, these shortcuts, and I'm simply adding this observation that the degree of irrationality that involves is not atemporal, embedded in nature for all time with all humans. It is rather something that changes with different social conditions, and that in conditions of high inequality, high degree of extraction, domination, rent seeking, and all that,
our brains don't work so good.
Our brains don't work so good, and we like end up trying to become something like the Great Gatsby. We don't realize what we're aiming for until we get it, and then we discover that's not what we wanted.
Sometimes it's not what you want, but you do it anyway.
Just keep going. Yeah. Well, look, we can't solve all the human condition here. We're just we're going for small bits.
I want to just come back a little bit to your plutocrat Princeton pals, or rich people, the 9.9% and above, because you mentioned that, look, it's ludicrous that anyone's worth $50 million a year, but for all of these upper classes, right, they've got a justification, right? This natural belief that we go out into the market and we put in talent, effort, brain power, brain sweat, you say in the book, and the free market spits out money at us depending on how much we put in. And so if I'm one of these people saying I don't want anyone to build in my neighborhood, I'm going to tell you, hey, listen, I had to go through having a tiger mom and a helicopter dad and go through private school and do all this, fight my way up to the elite universities, and now I'm working 80 hours a week at Goldman. So how are you going to tell me I don't deserve this? I got here because I am the best and the brightest. I went through that, contest, and I'm productive to society, and that's why I'm getting so much money. So that is why the 9.9% is pulling away, not because we are stealing from the 90%.
Yeah, well, so first thing I do is offer that person a copy of my book, and then I would point out that this is what the people...
They would pay someone to read it for them.
That's right, but this is what the people who helped build the pyramids in Egypt would have said too. I mean, in turns out that in building those pyramids, you had gangs of workers, and you had or slaves basically, and then you had overseers, and the overseers did pretty well. I mean, the archaeological evidence says that they got some fatty cuts of beef and so on. They were all it worked out pretty well for that class of people. And you just have to ask yourself, how happy are you building pyramids for the pharaoh? I mean, if that's how you find meaning in life, okay. The other thing I would ask, I mean, I can confront that sort of argument head on, and I try to do that in the book. Confront it head on by pointing to the facts that this so-called free market that person is talking about is quite fictional. That when they want to maintain the value of their home, they're not relying on a free market. They're demanding that the government step in and prevent things from happening, prevent people from developing, so that they can retain the value of their property. So I can show that that's a fiction. I can look at the merit claims and show that statistically it's kind of nonsense. You look at the distribution of wealth and you look at the distribution of anything that would qualify as merit, and there's simply no matchup. But what I find is that that's not effective, because we're talking about a religion, and a religion
right.
that helps people make sense of life. And I think also because that, like any religion, it has some, kernels of truth. It's got something that's good. I mean, of course, working hard is better than not working hard. And of course, people should get rewarded for working hard, and, get punished or not rewarded for not working hard. But what I would ask those people to do, what I hope to try to do, is ask them to sort of look into themselves. That's why I say, are you happy building a pyramid for the pharaoh? Because my sense is that they're not as happy as they think they are. That their idea of success has been handed to them, and they're filling it out by getting the job at Goldman Sachs, and then getting the big house and so on. And yeah, it might be better than many of the alternatives, but is it really working out so well? I mean, the extreme stresses that involves, the sort of near abuse levels of child rearing, all that
right.
kind of stuff. Is it working out? And it's not just a question about self-interest there. It's that if it's not working out, it's probably because the big injustices in the system are in some ways playing out at a micro level too, even for those who are supposedly doing well, even for the winners. An unfair system tends to have, little bits of unfairness. And
well, that's one of the great things, about the book, is that you're talking about a class that has gotten so much richer than everyone else, and in many ways is doing very well, but it doesn't sound very fun to be them. It's almost like the rising inequality. It's any elites are kind of on a tightrope or a high wire, but you're just raising it higher and higher and raising the stakes of falling, which makes people all the more anxious in the way they conduct their lives. But you say that it's handier to ask people if they're happy building pyramids for the pharaohs. But there is also a lot of points in the book, I just want to add for anyone who's listening, where you make some pretty good arguments and illustrations of why people don't necessarily deserve this money in the way they think they do. So if you think, right, you talk about the McKinsey meeting, and they're basically getting a bunch of money from authoritarian governments who are extracting rents, and they're like, God, we're so smart. Like, how? We made this with our spreadsheets and our brains and our Ivy League degrees. So the question there is just, are you still concerned with debunking this myth of meritocracy? Because I still feel that when I speak to people in the 9.9%, they really do believe in this sort of natural view of the economy, that they're being rewarded for something special about them.
Yeah, no, I'm very concerned to debunk it. I mean, that is I guess a central argument of the book, and it's a central form of this delusion, right? That I want to get at. Inequality leads people to misunderstand themselves. It leads them to misunderstand the sources of their own value. The reality about human societies is that we as humans are incredibly successful in creating wealth when we work together. It's simple, it's banal, and it's true. Wealth basically comes from people working together. And yes, individual talents, of course, that add, the guy who can, chop the 5 blocks of wood instead of the 4, well, yeah, maybe that helps a bit too. But the far more important thing is establishing that cooperation, that form of justice. And when we imagine that there's a society where everything comes down to individual merit, we're just misunderstanding where our actual wealth, our real well-being comes from. And yeah, these 9.9%ers now, I mean, I just have to say, give me a break. I mean, they're, of course it's wonderful that they have these really high-paying jobs, but it's not that they didn't create those jobs with their brains. Those jobs were created by a maldistribution of wealth, and they just their brains help them figure out how to be the one who happened to latch onto the little lump of cheese that was sitting there waiting for them. So. And do they really think that these other people who didn't, succeed in this, the bizarre admissions processes and the strange interview protocols and all that those people have less merit, that they actually contribute less to society because they didn't, snag on to this spot that happened to be seated next to a gusher of free cash? I mean, come on, grow up, guys.
Yeah, well, it's I nod along vigorously when you say it, but I went to the special universities in England, and so I will say that privileged kids from everywhere are kind of like this, but the American Ivy Leaguers were the worst. Just in terms of telling me about their achievements. Like, you're 20, you don't have any.
Yeah, no, and the sense of entitlement that they exude is just, it's astonishing, because they come in and they kind of expect that they're going to be put in the right next to the chairman's seat or whatever, for on the basis of nothing, but they have been brought up in a system that tells them that they have this remarkable value, and this is something that is observable in human societies throughout history. I mean, the people who are raised in power simply come to believe that the power emanates from within their very own little bodies and brains, and it's
hard not
true.
To. It's the only thing you can control.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's better for them in a sense to believe that, but it's not better for society, and ultimately, I guess I'm arguing it's not great for them either. I mean, living in a delusion. I mean, this book, I should also mention, it originated out of another book I've just finished on the Civil War, the struggle over slavery, and I think that some of the same processes played out in the rise of the Southern slaveholding oligarchy. So anyway, but that's a whole other topic.
Let me ask you this then. You were talking a little bit about how it affects 9.9 percenters to believe this about themselves, that they are taking credit for it. What about the effects on the people who don't make it? Because the way you tell the story, it's that the 9.9%, it's a culture, and that applies far more widely than the people who actually have the money to belong to it. So what does it tell people who don't get the McKinsey job?
Yeah, I mean, sociologically speaking, the data is pretty incontrovertible. I mean, it tells them, broadly speaking, and only in a statistical sense, not in every individual case, that they are less worthy. They're less worthy of finding a marriage partner, if that's what they want. They are less worthy of social respect, and that they are unproductive, that they don't really contribute much to society. That's what it tells them. And it shows up in, the health numbers, mental health as well as physical health. All in a broad statistical sense, but there's absolutely no question that this is the message that is getting down very effectively to the people who are not making it. And I just want to stress that I'm not saying that everyone in the bottom 90% is sad. That's just not the case. Plenty of people find really active, productive lives with any level of economic well-being. But statistically speaking, that's what we are creating: is a society where you got a small group who can claim to be happy because they've achieved what it is you're supposed to achieve, but that success does come to a significant degree on the basis of keeping a whole bunch of other people feeling unworthy and lacking in respect.
Yeah, it's interesting and really too bad.
Yeah, suck it up, deal with it.
Yeah. I have a feeling this book pissed some people off, right? So I wrote a very short piece once about meritocracy, and it's about, it's false, and believing in it makes you a worse person. And that was years ago, and to this day, I still get the occasional message telling me I'm an idiot. So who did this book aggravate, and why are they mad at you?
Yeah, it obviously did. It does piss a lot of people off, and I get a fair amount of that kind of reaction. And look, there's a really simple explanation. I mean, this is part of the religion that most people use to organize their lives, and that religion convinces them not only that they are good, but that they're doing good for the world, right? Like, so when they go out and work hard and get that that professional job. This is it's good. It's what society is telling them to do, and anyone who suggests otherwise is just the devil. And you get so that there's that one individualistic response. There's also the the success of many years of red baiting and anti-communist stuff that basically tells people that anybody who dares to question our market, suggests that it's not free, and suggests that there are a lot of oligopolies running around there, and a lot of cartels, all that. Anyone who breathes a word that suggests that the market is not absolutely free is a communist.
Oh yeah, the Reds,
is the socialist and so on, and it's like Venezuela, next stop. So there's a certain amount of that, but I think the main reason is the first. It's that people organize their lives around this pursuing merit, and I think that. I insist that there is some good idea at the root of it. My issue is, don't mistake an ideal for a description of reality, and I think that's what a lot of these people are doing. And of course, then when you say it's not real, and they think you're destroying their very fabric of existence.
Yeah. So I mean, do you? Your personal history, from what I know of it from this conversation, seems a pretty straight down the line 9.9% type life, like fancy schools, management consulting, and then you could even say the cultural power of being an author. And And the reason I ask is, have you run into problems with old friends or acquaintances where they're like, Matthew, what are you saying? This is ridiculous.
No, I mean, I think that most members of the 9.9% have enough self-awareness to grant that there is some validity to the critique. So I think that this sort of extreme hostile reaction isn't actually representing a majority. I think it's representing a kind of, fanatical minority. I think most are open to it. I mean, I get some resistance, and yeah, there's the the sort of what I consider the pseudo hypocrisy charge. Like, oh yeah, well, you got a fancy degree, so I guess you can you're just engaging in self-critique or guilt or something like that. To which I would just say, I'm not. I don't know if it matters. I mean, like, okay, you could say whatever you want about me. I'm just calling what I think is what I see.
Yeah.
I think,
and you would know, right?
and I should also just point out to him, in terms of my own personal history, choosing to become an author. You're right that there's a certain kind of pursuit of cultural power or something like that. Mm-hmm. I have to say that I have not achieved it, so that's but nonetheless, there is that. However, I think you have to at least acknowledge that as an economic plan for getting in the 9.9%, it's a really, really bad plan. Okay, so I just want everyone to know that. I mean, I'm not going to say I do it all out of charity, but there wouldn't be any difference if I did it out of charity. And the other point I would just make historically is that, well, in my writing, I make a big deal out of the my grandparents' generation, who did come from a temporarily wealthy and then lost it all kind of situation. I mean, my background was extremely middle class. I mean, it was like my father was a Marine, and we lived not in the nicer suburbs, but in the kind of plain vanilla ones. And I know it sounds naive and unpleasant to suggest this, but when I applied to universities, I really did not know that it would lead to a high income. I didn't know what a management consultant was, and I went.
None of us did.
Yeah, and I went to those places because I thought that's where people who wanted to do research into, natural things, into what actually happens in the world. I thought that's where they go. You find smart people who don't give a crap about stupid jobs and bureaucracies and titles, but who just want to investigate nature, want to study physics, or as it turns out, philosophy. So I know it sounds kind of naive, but that's kind of what I thought. And I guess if I have an ideal that I, some sort of nostalgia, which of course is always problematic, but if I have that, it would be for, something along those lines where, yeah, you have, of course you have smart people trying to, look for, centers of excellence and do great things, but, it doesn't have to be about investment banking. I mean, it can be people who actually want to learn something about the world.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was not at all trying to accuse you of being rich or something. It was much more of just the point you've almost made, which is that coming from outside of these elite institutions, it's easy to think that they're there, for this higher purpose of learning, about the big questions and so on and natural things. But having gone through it, that probably gave you a much better perspective to write this kind of book. To see the universities as more of a sorting mechanism and so on than this romanticized view of disinterested learning.
Right.
Okay, well, this has been great. I want to thank you for being on. This has been a super interesting conversation. And if you'd like to add anything for the audience, please do now.
Oh no, I just want to thank you for taking the time and having a very interesting conversation. It's really wonderful.
All right, thanks.